What's going on, everybody? It's Matt, and I'm back with another video about the NBA trade deadline. Now, this was a crazy one, and we're going to get into some winners, some losers, and some teams in between. Now, before we get started, please remember to like and subscribe, as it really helps me out and helps the channel. Now, without further ado, let's talk some basketball. My first winner for this year's trade deadline is the Miami Heat, and their biggest move was acquiring Victor Oladipo from the Houston Rockets for what I have here is, quote, basically nothing. They traded Avery Bradley, a guard who's barely played for them this season, Kelly Olynyk, a center/4 that's on a very big contract, and a pick swap in 2022. So really not giving up that much out of your playoff rotation for a guy that can immediately come in and contribute. I will say Victor Oladipo has been very inconsistent this season with the Houston Rockets, and his availability is something that's always been in question ever since he tore his ACL a couple years ago. With that being said, his play is immediately going to impact Jimmy Butler, Tyler Hero, and Bam Adebayo, as he can defend multiple positions, he can handle the ball, and he can score at a pretty efficient rate. Now, this hasn't happened yet, but apparently the Heat are in rumors to get LaMarcus Aldridge through the buyout market, and I think this is a perfect move for them. They can basically replace Kelly Olynyk on a guy on a minimum contract that is probably better than Kelly Olynyk at this point, and provides veteran leadership, playoff experience, and a very good leader to have alongside Jimmy Butler and Goran Dragic. Now, as the Heat are reloading and retooling to fight their way back into the Eastern Conference title picture, I still think they're a few moves away. Now, there's going to be a lot of guys coming through in the buyout market that they can take advantage of, but I still think that their perimeter defense on teams like Brooklyn and Philadelphia is going to be crazy come playoff time with guys like Dragic, Oladipo, and Butler, to just name a few. Now, this one didn't happen at the deadline, but they made a move to acquire Trevor Ariza from the Oklahoma City Thunder, and I think this is a very overlooked move by a lot of teams, as Trevor Ariza provides exactly what playoff and championship teams need: 3-point scoring and perimeter defense. And giving up a guy that's probably not going to be in the NBA much longer, and a second-round pick is really not that much to get a guy like Trevor Ariza on your squad. Overall, I'd say I give the Heat probably an A for this year's trade deadline, as they made moves without giving up much and shored up their playoff rotation when it comes down to it. Team number 2 is the Denver Nuggets, and man, did they make some fantastic moves to help solidify their spot as one of the top teams in the West. First off, they traded Gary Harris, RJ Hampton, and a protected first-round pick to Orlando for Aaron Gordon and Gary Clark. And I think that this is probably the perfect matchup to place next to Nikola Jokic after the leaving and absence of Jeremy Grant this season. He can shoot the 3-ball pretty well for 4. His perimeter defense is something that's very underrated and can help hide Michael Porter Jr. as he develops as a defender. Their second move, they got JaVale McGee, who I think is a very good backup center to have next to Jokic, as he basically does everything that Jokic doesn't do. He's an athlete, and he's a very good rim protector. This is a pretty cost-effective move to bring in a backup to help Nikola Jokic, and also to provide a lob threat for guys like Will Barton and Jamal Murray to throw lobs to, as well as shore up their defense with guys with the absence of Mason Plumlee over the past season. They've kind of had to rely on Jokic a little bit too much, and it's kind of taking away his presence on the offensive end. The only downside for this is probably getting rid of Gary Harris, your starting 2 guard, but you have to give something up to get something, and I think Aaron Gordon is a very good fit with this Denver Nuggets team. They've always been in the rumors for guys like Jrue Holiday and Victor Oladipo this season, which makes sense because they needed an upgrade at the 2 guard, and now you just gave away your probably best 2 guard. But at the same time, I think that they'll be fine because this playoff rotation is going to shorten up, and guys like Aaron Gordon can come in and impact the court immediately. Overall, I think I'd give the Nuggets a B to a B+, because they made the moves that they had to make to help Jokic out, while also not really sacrificing that much, although they gave up a young piece in RJ Hampton, but he wasn't really playing that much anyway. Last but not least, my biggest winner for this year's trade deadline is the Chicago Bulls, and they traded Wendell Carter, Otto Porter, and 2 first-round picks to Orlando for Nikola Vucevic and Al-Farouq Aminu. Al-Farouq Aminu was basically make the salary work, but Nikola Vucevic is such an underrated and underappreciated player that I think is going to pair very, very well with Zach LaVine, Patrick Williams, and Kobe White. Now, although he's not as great of a defender as Wendell Carter was, and Wendell Carter wasn't a particularly great defender to begin with, Vooch is one of the most elite centers in the NBA when it comes down to his scoring, playmaking ability, impact, rebounding, and shooting from the big man position, which is huge for a guy like Zach LaVine. Now, I could see a pick and roll between LaVine and Vucevic to be very effective, as both can either step out behind the three-point line, work in the post, and slash at the rim, with guys like LaVine's one of the best high flyers of all time. They also traded for Daniel Theis, moving Mo Wagner, and also acquiring Troy Brown, which I think are very good moves. Daniel Theis is a very underrated center as well as Vucevic. Obviously not as good, but he provides some of the similar aspects that Vucevic provides, although he might be a little bit of a better defender, while still providing some three-point scoring from outside. Now, Troy Brown is very interesting. I don't think he was given that much of a chance on Washington, but now he can kind of revitalize his career, replacing Otto Porter possibly in that rotation, or taking some minutes away from Garrett Temple. But I think that's a very good move for Chicago, and it was very cost-effective too. They only gave up Daniel Gafford and replaced him with Daniel Theis, and then got rid of Chandler Hutchison and brought in Troy Brown. So the swap's fairly neutral, although I do think that this gives Patrick Williams more room to grow, as he probably will get an expanded role. Same with guys like Thaddeus Young. Kobe White will hopefully get more minutes too, to kind of develop him into a playmaker. But overall, I think the Bulls hit it out of the park, getting another all-star to pair with Zach LaVine. So I'm going to give them an A+. Now, the first loser of this year's trade deadline is sad to say, but it's the Houston Rockets. Beginning this season, they had a very promising roster with a rehabilitating John Wall. You got Christian Wood on a very, very inexpensive contract, and you had James Harden. With that being said, they traded James Harden to Brooklyn, and I think that was one of the most mishandled situations in the NBA, possibly in NBA history, as they could have had a package from other teams like Philly centered around Ben Simmons, Matisse Thybulle, and picks, but instead they got Caris LeVert, which eventually shipped him out. Didn't even get Jarrett Allen, a promising young big, to pair next to Christian Wood. And you got a bunch of 7th and 8th graders right now who those picks might hit, but at this point, like what it's looking like now is sad to say, but it's probably going to be picks in the late 20s. So you got rid of Harden for basically a bunch of role players with a chance of getting a star. Now they moved Caris LeVert to Indiana and brought in Victor Oladipo, which I think is probably the most puzzling thing about this whole situation, because Caris LeVert is a very promising guy, and if you're going to rebuild, you have guys like Kevin Porter Jr. now, Caris LeVert, and Christian Wood to all develop into pretty solid players. And you decide to move Caris LeVert for an aging Victor Oladipo on an expiring contract. And Victor Oladipo wasn't very happy that he was traded to Houston, didn't really want to be there, and basically forced his way out to a team that makes sense for him. But the package that they got in return for Victor Oladipo, who was a former All-Star, is very, very lacking. Now, as I said before, they had some young talent like Kevin Porter Jr. and Christian Wood, and even guys like Jae'Sean Tate have very promising careers ahead. However, moves that they've made this season, such as the James Harden trade and the Kelly Olynyk deal with Miami to bring in Kelly Olynyk and Avery Bradley, are really setting this team up for failure in the future. And some of these picks might hit, where they might get a star, but as it's looking right now, the Houston Rockets are a dumpster fire in the NBA, with some few gems in the making in Kevin Porter Jr. and Christian Wood, who might not want to be there long term. My second loser on this list is the New Orleans Pelicans, and they really didn't do that much, but I have them losing JJ Redick for basically not much. James Johnson is a very solid player, but him on a $14 million contract, even if it's expiring, is still not a great move considering Redick's ability to shoot the ball, and I thought that was a great move for Dallas. But their biggest move was not trading Lonzo Ball, because I think that if they decide to let him walk this offseason, it's going to be such a bad move, because Lonzo and Zion are very good together, Lonzo's improved his three-point shooting immensely since the beginning of this season, and his lob threat with his passing ability to Zion's slashing ability and high flying ability is something that not many teams have in this league or will ever have in this league. Although, if they were to trade Lonzo, the main guy that they could have gotten seemed to be Lauri Markkanen, which I think is a very interesting fit next to Zion. Maybe not much defensively, but as a stretch big, it hides Zion's ability not to be able to shoot the ball, which Steven Adams actually highlights instead of hides. Overall, the Pelicans are probably fine. They have a great young core with Zion, Brandon Ingram, and even guys like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and if they bring back Lonzo, him too. But if they're going to move on from Lonzo and start this new era with Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Kyra Lewis as their backcourt, they needed to get something for him. And I'm not ruling out the possibility of a sign and trade this offseason, which could very well happen. But overall, I think that the Pelicans really messed this up and could have gotten some value for a very good player that a championship team could have wanted to have in their backcourt. Now, I have 4 teams that I couldn't really decide whether I thought they were winners or losers. And the first one I'm going to start off with is the Orlando Magic. Now, I've already talked about the Magic a couple times because they made some good moves. I think they realized that having guys like Nikola Vucevic and Aaron Gordon, and I'll soon talk about him, but Evan Fournier, wasn't really going to get you anywhere, and I think they needed to rely on their young guys like Jonathan Isaac, Markelle Fultz, Cole Anthony, and Chuma Okeke, like some really good guys that they can use to develop and start out a new young core in Orlando. But I think they didn't really get that much value. I think RJ Hampton could be a very solid player in the NBA, and getting a first-round pick with RJ Hampton from Denver was very solid, and even Gary Harris can still contribute. But getting 2 seconds from Boston for Evan Fournier just seems like it wasn't enough. Like, I feel like they could have gotten maybe one of their young guys like Aaron Nesmith, even Carson Edwards, like just to get somebody back. But getting 2 seconds on most likely picks that aren't going to turn out to be anything special, I think the Magic kind of messed this up. But then again, they're starting a rebuild with guys like Wendell Carter and Mo Bamba in your backcourt, or in your front court, and guys like Markelle Fultz, Cole Anthony, Jonathan Isaac playing the wings and guard position, which could be very promising for the future. However, I think they could have handled the situation a little bit better, but overall, they're heading in the right direction. Now, next up, we got the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, the biggest move of this entire deadline was trying to get Kyle Lowry back home in Philadelphia, and they didn't get it done. Now, say what you want, I think this was a very solid move not acquiring Kyle Lowry, especially considering what the price was. I think they could have gotten a guy like Lonzo Ball for much cheaper and still kept a guy like Danny Green, who's been very integral to their team chemistry and defensive presence. However, they did make a move, and I think this is one of the most underrated and underappreciated moves of this trade deadline, which is picking up George Hill for Tony Bradley, Vincent Poirier, Terrence Ferguson, and 4 second-round picks in a 3-team deal. And they brought in Ignas Brazdeikis too, but I don't think he's going to play that much. But George Hill is a very, very underappreciated guard that is, and this is a move that championship teams have to make. Getting a backup point guard to relieve the pressure off of Shake Milton, bringing more defense to the bench, and providing one of, if not the best three-point shooters statistically from last season with the Bucks. George Hill is a very good guy to have on your team. On top of that, Danny Green played with George Hill in San Antonio and has gone on record saying that this was a great move, and this is something that they've been trying to do for a very long time to bring into Philly. Now, with that being said, they did lose Tony Bradley, who's been a very emerging, promising young center. And with that, as of right now, they have one center on the roster, and that's Dwight Howard. And as we saw this past recently against the Los Angeles Lakers, Dwight Howard can easily get into foul trouble and at this point get ejected, leaving the Sixers very thin. So I could expect them to be big players on the buyout market for guys like DeMarcus Cousins possibly, LaMarcus Aldridge as well, and guys even like Gorgui Dieng, because he's stretch big that can kind of defend, which would be a very solid pairing with Ben Simmons. But overall, I think this was a good move. Bringing in a championship level point guard, keeping your offensive continuity, and shoring up your bench and getting rid of nobody that's going to be in your playoff rotation, and still keeping your young talent in Tyrese Maxey and Matisse Thybulle. So keeping yourself set up for the future while also getting ready to win now. I think this was a very good move for the Sixers. However, not getting Kyle Lowry could end up to bite them if they don't make it far in the playoffs, because not having that championship experience while still getting an all-star level player back is something that could be questionable coming down the line. Now, the next two teams actually traded with each other a lot, and that's Portland and Toronto. But first, let's talk about Portland. They traded Gary Trent and Rodney Hood to Toronto for Norman Powell. And in my opinion, I feel like this is a very lateral move, because you're going to have to pay Norman Powell big money in the offseason for a guy in Gary Trent who is probably going to get a little bit less money but still provides the same offensive capabilities as Norman Powell does, maybe not at the same level. Now, their backcourt has always been very crowded with Lillard and McCollum, and they've had other guards like Anthony Simons, and now they have Norman Powell thrown into the mix, and this kind of screws them up a little bit. Although Norman Powell is like almost an oversized 2/3, I feel like they could have kept Gary Trent and Rodney Hood, kept some of your depth, and still had some very good three-point shooting to surround Lillard and McCollum with. But I think their biggest move was not getting a big or a 4/5, because right now they're starting Robert Covington or Derek Jones, depending on who you want to put there. And the small ball lineup works to a certain extent, but if they're going to have to go up against guys like Anthony Davis and Marc Gasol and Montrezl Harrell and Nikola Jokic and DeAndre Ayton in the playoffs, their best center right now is Enes Kanter, who's okay, I guess. He's a good rebounder, but he doesn't really provide much defensively other than offensive rebounds, and he can score in the post, but against a guy like Anthony Davis, he's going to shut him down. But however, I do think that the Norman Powell move it's okay, because you still get a 20-point per game score, and having a 20-point per game score is very good for a championship aspiring team, and to pair him alongside McCollum and Lillard. So now you have 3 elite scorers on your team, and they're very injured, getting guys like Yusuf Nurkic back hopefully soon, and Zach Collins will shore up their front court a little bit, but I think they could have done more. Now, last but not least, we have the Toronto Raptors. Now, their biggest thing going into this trade deadline was the sad departure of Kyle Lowry. And what did they do? They didn't trade Kyle Lowry. Now, this is a very interesting thing, because there's a multitude of draft picks and young players thrown in the mix that the Toronto Raptors could have taken advantage of. But at the end of the day, they didn't feel like they were going to get enough for Kyle Lowry. And now they're stuck with him. I wouldn't say stuck, but they're with him for the rest of the season, which could lead to him leaving in free agency, which could totally flip the situation on Toronto's head. Now, teams like Miami and Philly were always in the mix, and even the Lakers lately. But I think a young guy like Tyler Hero and picks probably would have been a little bit better than losing him for nothing and keeping the cap space. Even a guy like Tyrese Maxey and Danny Green would have been 2 solid contributors. Bringing back Danny Green could have mentored young guys like OG Anunoby and even Pascal Siakam to a certain extent to help them bolster up their defensive presence. But overall, they traded away a couple roster spots too, which I thought was kind of interesting. Guys like Matt Thomas, who's a good shooter, and Terrence Davis, for basically doing nothing. I guess, I don't know. It's going to be hard to decide what they're going to do, because they still got some talent in Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby and Fred VanVleet, but I think they're going to have to start to go in a new direction, and that's going to be post-Kawhi Leonard, post-Kyle Lowry, and they need to find their identity now, and possibly Lowry's a sign-and-trade candidate in the spring, but honestly, we have no idea. So at this moment, they're a very confusing front office to really depict. Thank you so much for watching my breakdown of this year's trade deadline and all the moves that were made. Now, as always, please remember to like and subscribe, as it truly helps me out and I really appreciate it. Now, with all that being said, that's going to be it for me today, so I'll catch you guys in the next one.